The truck's engine wheezed like an old man climbing stairs. I kept my foot steady on the gas pedal, watching the temperature gauge creep toward the red zone as we climbed higher into the mountains. 3 months since I'd lost everything: the restaurant, the apartment. Hell, even my good knives got repossessed. The bank took it all with the same cold efficiency they'd shown when they'd foreclosed on my parents' house 15 years back. But this job posting? Christ, I must have read it a dozen times. Line cook position at some remote lodge. Pay that seemed too good to be true. Room and board included through the winter months. The kind of money that could get me back on my feet. Maybe even let me start over somewhere nobody knew about the failure I'd become. The road kept twisting upward, gravel crunching under my tires. Pine trees pressed in from both sides, their branches scraping against the truck's paint. What little was left of it anyway. I could smell the altitude in the air, that thin mountain scent that made your lungs work harder. The steering wheel vibrated in my hands as we hit another pothole, and I wondered how the hell delivery trucks made it up here, or if they even bothered. That's when I saw it through the windshield. Blackpine Lodge squatted on the cliff edge like something out of a Gothic novel, all dark wood and steep angles. The building looked older than it had any right to be, weathered gray by decades of mountain storms. Windows reflected the afternoon sun in ways that made them look like empty eye sockets. I pulled into what passed for a parking area, really just a widened section of dirt road with room for maybe 4 vehicles. My truck looked pathetic next to the single black sedan already parked there, some expensive foreign thing that probably cost more than I'd made in my best year at the restaurant. The engine ticked as it cooled, and suddenly the silence felt enormous. No traffic, no city noise, nothing but wind through the pines and the distant sound of what might have been a stream somewhere far below. I sat there for a minute, hands still gripping the steering wheel, and wondered what the hell I'd gotten myself into. But the bank account was empty, and winter was coming. I grabbed my duffel bag from the passenger seat and climbed out. The front door opened before I could knock. The woman who appeared in the doorway looked like she'd stepped out of an old photograph. Not old in a vintage way, but old in the sense that she seemed to belong to a different time entirely. Medium height, maybe 5'6", with silver hair pulled back so tight it looked painful. Her skin had that translucent quality you sometimes see in very elderly people, pale as paper and just as thin. "You must be Dennis," she said, and her voice had the kind of formality you don't hear much anymore, like she'd learned to speak from old movies. "I'm Fern Cruz, the lodge manager." I shifted the duffel bag to my left hand and extended my right. Her handshake was wrong. That's the only way I can describe it. Her fingers felt cold even though it wasn't particularly chilly, and they trembled against mine like she was fighting some kind of palsy. But her grip was firm, almost desperate, like she was holding on to something she couldn't afford to lose. "Thanks for having me," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. The drive up was interesting. She smiled then, but it didn't reach her eyes. Those were dark, not brown, not black, but some color that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Hollow, like she'd seen things that had carved out pieces of her from the inside. "Yes, the road can be challenging," she said, "especially once the snow begins. That's why we prefer our winter staff to arrive early. Once December settles in, you won't be leaving until spring." The way she said it made it sound less like a warning and more like a promise, or maybe a threat. "Now then," she continued, stepping back to let me inside, "there are certain protocols you'll need to follow during your employment here. Strict protocols. The lodge has very specific requirements." I followed her into a lobby that smelled like old wood and something else I couldn't quite identify. Something organic and slightly sweet, like flowers left too long in water. The ceiling stretched up into shadows, supported by massive beams that probably came from trees that had been growing when my grandfather was born. Everything was dark wood and darker corners, with furniture that looked like it belonged in a museum. "What kind of protocols?" I asked, but she was already moving toward a staircase that curved up along the far wall. "You'll learn," she said without looking back. "Everything will be explained in due time. For now, let me show you to your quarters." I wanted to ask more questions about the kitchen setup, about what kind of food I'd be preparing, about how many guests the lodge typically hosted, but something about the way she moved through the building stopped me. She glided rather than walked, her footsteps making no sound on the hardwood floors, like she was floating just above the surface of the world. We climbed the stairs in silence, past windows that looked out over the cliff face and into the valley below. The view should have been breathtaking, but something about it felt wrong, too isolated, too far from anything resembling civilization. "Here we are," she said, stopping in front of a door marked with a simple brass number, 7. "Your room. Meals are served in the main dining hall at 6 in the morning, noon, and 6 in the evening. Kitchen work begins at 5. You'll find everything you need inside." She handed me an old-fashioned brass key, the kind with teeth that looked like they'd been filed by hand. Our fingers brushed as I took it, and again I felt that strange coldness, like touching ice that hadn't quite frozen solid. "Rest well," she said. "Tomorrow we begin in earnest." And then she was gone, disappeared around the corner of the hallway with that same silent glide. I stood there for a moment, key in hand, listening to the lodge settle around me. Old buildings make noise. They creak and sigh and whisper as the wood expands and contracts. But this was different. This sounded almost like breathing. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The room was sparse but clean. A single bed with a metal frame, a small dresser, a window that looked out toward the parking area. Everything I owned fit easily in the space. Hell, everything I owned barely filled the duffel bag. I dropped the bag on the floor and sat on the edge of the bed. The mattress was firmer than I expected, and the springs didn't squeak. Good quality, just old. Everything in this place seemed old but well-maintained, like someone had been taking care of it for decades without ever updating it. That's when I noticed the corner of paper sticking out from under the pillow. I pulled it free and unfolded it. The paper felt rough, homemade almost, and covered in handwriting that started neat but deteriorated as it went on. At the top, in careful script, "Rules for kitchen staff, Blackpine Lodge." 10 rules, numbered and listed. The first few were normal enough. Report to kitchen at 5 a.m., no alcohol during work hours, maintain cleanliness standards, standard restaurant stuff. But as I read further down, my stomach started to twist. Rule 7. Never enter the basement after dark. Rule 8. If you hear your name called from empty rooms, do not answer. Rule 9. The meat in the walk-in freezer is not always what it appears to be. Check the labels twice. Rule 10. I had to read it 3 times before my brain would process the words. The handwriting had changed completely by then, becoming frantic scratches that looked like they'd been carved into the paper with fingernails rather than written with any kind of pen. Do not trust her. She is not what she seems. They are always watching. Get out while you still... The words stopped mid-sentence, trailing off into what looked like claw marks in the paper. I should have known something was off the moment I stepped into that kitchen for my first dinner service. The smell hit me first. Not the usual mix of grease and spice you'd expect, but something else underneath. Something sweet and rotten, like flowers left too long in stagnant water. Fern had given me a quick tour earlier, pointing out the industrial ranges, the walk-in freezer, the prep stations. Standard restaurant setup, she'd said. Nothing I hadn't worked with before. But standing there at 5:30 that evening, watching the dining room fill through the service window, I felt this crawling sensation between my shoulder blades, like being watched by something that didn't blink. The guests. Christ, I still can't make sense of what I saw that first night. They filed in wearing normal clothes, wool sweaters, pressed slacks, the kind of upscale casual you'd expect at a mountain lodge. But when I caught glimpses of them in the polished steel surfaces around me, The reflection just wasn't there. Not like vampire movies where there's nothing at all. More like the steel was showing me the dining room exactly as it should be, empty tables and chairs, while my eyes saw people sitting right there. I kept wiping down the prep counter, thinking maybe it was just the angle. The way light bounced off curved surfaces could play tricks. Had to be that. Then they started ordering. Their voices came through the service window like grinding stone, not the pitch, but the texture, like someone had taken normal human speech and dragged it across concrete until it wore rough. "The lamb," one of them said, and the words seemed to scrape against my eardrums. "Medium rare." Another wanted the trout, another the pasta special. Simple enough requests, but delivered in voices that made my teeth ache. And their eyes, Jesus, their eyes. They watched me through that window without blinking. Not once. I kept checking, timing it against my knife work, counting seconds, 30, 60, 2 minutes of constant staring while I prepped their orders. Normal people blink every few seconds. It's automatic. You don't even think about it. But these guests just fixed those unblinking gazes on me like I was the most fascinating thing they'd ever seen. The meat started acting up when I laid it on the cutting board. I'd worked with plenty of fresh lamb in my time, knew how it should look and feel. This piece seemed normal enough when I pulled it from the walk-in, good marbling, proper color, no off smells. But the moment I set it down to trim, it started moving. Not jumping around like a fish out of water, more like breathing, rising and falling in slow, rhythmic pulses while I held my knife above it. I stopped cutting and stared at the damn thing. Had to be my imagination. Maybe the fluorescent lights were creating some optical illusion, making shadows shift in ways that suggested movement. I pressed my palm against the meat to hold it steady and felt it pulse against my skin like a heartbeat. The vegetables were worse. When I sliced into the carrots for the garnish, they bled. Not the orange juice you'd normally see, but thick, dark fluid that pooled on the cutting board and stained my whites. The celery leaked the same stuff when I diced it, and the onions, Christ, the onions wept actual tears, clear liquid that rolled down their papery sides and hissed when it hit the hot prep surface. But the pasta, that's what really got to me. I'd made fresh linguine that afternoon, hung it to dry like I'd done 1,000 times before. Normal pasta dough, normal technique. When I dropped it in the boiling water for the special, it started moving like it was alive. Not just floating and bobbing from the bubbling water, but writhing, twisting around itself like pale worms, reaching up toward the surface, then diving back down in coordinated patterns that had nothing to do with convection currents. I stood there with my tongs, watching this impossible thing happen in my pot, and felt my sanity start to slip. This wasn't possible. Food didn't behave this way. There had to be some explanation. Altitude sickness maybe, making me hallucinate, or exhaustion from the drive, the stress of losing everything, the thin air up here, messing with my brain chemistry. That's what I told myself while I plated their meals with shaking hands. Altitude sickness, dehydration, too much caffeine and not enough sleep. The human mind could play incredible tricks when it was under stress, right? I'd read about that somewhere. The guests ate their writhing pasta and bleeding vegetables without comment, their unblinking eyes still fixed on me through the service window. But that was just the first night. The second night, I found every pot on the line boiling when I came in for prep. Not simmering, rolling, violent boils that sent steam billowing up to the exhaust hoods. The burners underneath were stone cold. I touched the control knobs, checked the pilot lights, ran my hand under each pot to feel for heat. Nothing, but the water kept churning like it was sitting over open flame. The third night, I discovered the knives. I always cleaned and put away my tools before leaving. Habit drilled into me since culinary school. But when I arrived for the morning shift, every knife in the kitchen was arranged on the main prep counter in perfect geometric patterns, not scattered or jumbled like someone had been playing around. Deliberate arrangements that looked almost ritualistic. Chef's knives forming triangles, paring knives creating intricate spirals, the cleaver positioned at the exact center of it all, like some kind of altarpiece. The oven started whispering my name on the fourth night. I was pulling sheet pans of dinner rolls when I heard it. My name spoken in languages I didn't recognize, but somehow knew were speaking to me. The voices came from inside the ovens themselves, muffled by the insulated walls but clear enough to understand. "Dennis," they whispered in what might have been Latin. "Dennis," in something that sounded like Russian. "Dennis," in clicking, throaty syllables that didn't seem human at all. The walk-in freezer became its own nightmare. The temperature gauge spun like a compass near a magnet, jumping from 20 below to 60 above and back again in seconds. But inside, the air felt perfectly normal, that crisp, dry cold you'd expect. The hanging sides of beef and pork swayed without any air movement to push them. No fans running, no drafts from the door, but those carcasses danced slow, hypnotic rhythms like kelp in an ocean current. And through it all, my reflection, I caught glimpses of myself in the stainless steel surfaces, the sides of pots, the prep counter edges, the polished backsplash behind the ranges. But the face looking back wasn't mine, same height, same build, but the cheeks were hollow and sunken like I hadn't eaten in weeks. The eyes sat deeper in their sockets, ringed with dark circles that made them look bruised. And the hands, Christ, the hands in the reflection were covered in cuts and burns, fingers moving frantically, even when my real hand stayed perfectly still. That other Dennis worked with desperate speed, preparing meals that steamed with heat no earthly fire could produce. He looked terrified, this reflection of me, glancing constantly over his shoulder at things I couldn't see. His mouth moved like he was screaming, but no sound reached my ears, just the endless, frantic preparation of impossible food for guests who cast no shadows and never blinked. I started avoiding the reflective surfaces after that, keeping my eyes down while I worked, but I could feel that other version of myself moving in the steel around me, trapped behind the surface, cooking for an eternity I couldn't understand. I'd been grabbing lamb shoulder from the main freezer section when I heard something fall deeper inside. Not just fall, clatter, metal against metal, like a knife hitting the floor. Should have left it alone. Rule 7 flashed through my mind, the one about not going certain places after dark. But this wasn't the basement, just the freezer's back corner where they stored. Hell, I didn't even know what they stored back there. Extra inventory maybe. Holiday supplies. The cold bit through my chef's whites as I pushed past hanging beef quarters toward the sound. My breath came out in sharp puffs that disappeared into the freezer's white void. The overhead bulb back here was dimmer, throwing everything into half shadows that shifted when I moved. That's when I saw the first one, hanging from a meat hook, arms at its sides, blue-white skin stretched tight over ribs, face frozen mid-scream, mouth open wide enough to see the blackened tongue inside, eyes bulged out like marbles someone had pressed too hard into soft clay. My brain tried to process it as another side of beef. Had to be. Some weird cut I wasn't familiar with, maybe veal but the fingers gave it away. 10 of them, curled into claws that had scraped grooves in their own palms before the cold took hold. I stumbled backward and hit another one with my shoulder. This one was smaller, younger. The hook went through its spine between the shoulder blades, and its head hung forward so I couldn't see the face at first. Thank Christ for that. When I finally looked, it was maybe 16 years old, 17 at most. Still had acne scars on its forehead. My stomach lurched, but nothing came up. Too empty. I'd been eating less and less since starting here. Something about the smell of the food we served. They were everywhere once I started seeing them properly. Dozens of bodies hanging in neat rows like some butcher's nightmare. Men, women, different ages and builds. All with that same blue-white skin and the same expression of absolute terror frozen on their faces. Some had been there longer than others. You could tell by how much frost had built up in their hair, their eyelashes. One woman near the back still had a name tag pinned to her shirt. "Hello, my name is Janet," in cheerful red letters. The plastic was cracked from the cold. I backed out of there fast as I could without running. Didn't want to make noise. Didn't want to draw attention to what I'd found. My hands shook so bad I could barely grip the lamb shoulder I'd come for in the first place. The rest of dinner service passed in a blur. I cooked on autopilot while my mind kept circling back to those faces, the way their mouths hung open, the scratches on their palms where they'd clawed at themselves, probably trying to stay warm as the cold took them, and the guests. Christ, the guests kept eating, kept staring at me with those unblinking eyes while they chewed and swallowed whatever I put in front of them. Their teeth made grinding sounds against the silverware, metal on bone. I made it through service somehow. Cleaned the kitchen, stored the knives, wiped down every surface twice. Normal routine, keeping my hands busy while my brain tried to make sense of what I'd seen. Bodies don't just end up in restaurant freezers. People don't disappear without someone noticing, without police getting involved, unless they do. Unless this place was so far off the map that nobody came looking. After Fern locked up and went wherever she went at night, I started searching. Had to know more. Had to understand what I'd stumbled into. Found it in the dry storage room, buried under 50-pound sacks of flour, like someone had hidden it in a hurry. A composition notebook with a black and white cover, the kind kids use in school. Pages yellowed around the edges and brittle from age. First page had a name written in careful block letters, Alvin Guzman. Below that, a date, March 15th, 1987, 37 years ago. I carried it back to my room and read by lamplight, turning pages carefully so they wouldn't crumble in my hands. Day 1. Arrived at Blackpine Lodge today. Strange place, but the pay is good and I need the work. Manager Mrs. Cruz seems nice enough, though there's something odd about her eyes. Kitchen is well equipped. Looking forward to the challenge. Normal enough start, but it got weird fast. Day 8. The guests don't eat the way normal people eat. They tear at their food with their teeth like animals, and they watch me constantly while I cook. Never blink, makes my skin crawl. Day 15. Found something disturbing in the walk-in today. What looked like human teeth mixed in with the ground beef. Had to be animal teeth, had to be. But they looked too much like molars, like someone's wisdom teeth. Day 23. The meat delivery truck came again, but I didn't see any driver. Truck was empty when I checked, but the freezer was fully stocked afterward. Where does the meat come from? Who's delivering it? The handwriting got shakier as the entries went on. More frantic. Day 31. They're not guests. They can't be guests. I watched one of them through the service window tonight and saw straight through him to the chair behind. But when I looked directly, he was solid again. What kind of place is this? Day 45. Found the basement door unlocked tonight. Stairs go down further than they should, deeper than the mountain should allow. Heard something moving down there, something big. Mrs. Cruz caught me listening in her eyes. They weren't human eyes anymore, all black, no whites at all. She smiled and said I was learning to see properly. Day 52. It's not a restaurant. We're not feeding guests. We're feeding something else. Something that lives under the mountain and has been here longer than the trees, longer than the rocks themselves. The guests are just echoes, shadows of the people it's already eaten, bound to this place forever. Day 58. Mrs. Cruz explained everything tonight, said I was ready to understand. The thing below is ancient, from before humans walked the earth. It sleeps most of the time but needs to feed. Human flesh prepared in specific ways, cooked with intention and fear. The terror makes the meat tender, she said, makes it more nutritious. My hands trembled holding the notebook. This couldn't be real. Had to be some kind of joke, some previous employee's idea of a prank to scare the new guy. But I kept reading. Day 64. She's been doing this for decades, collecting cooks, teaching them the recipes, letting them serve the echoes until they understand what they're really doing. Then they become part of the menu too. She doesn't age because it sustains her, part of some bargain she made long ago. Day 67. I can see myself in the freezer sometimes, standing with the others, blue and cold and empty. It's not a vision of what might happen, it's what will happen, what always happens. Day 70. Tried to leave today, but the truck won't start. None of the phones work. The road down the mountain just leads back to the lodge no matter which direction I drive. I'm trapped here like all the others. Day 73. The thing below is stirring. I can hear it moving at night, scraping against stone. Mrs. Cruz says it's almost time for the winter feeding. Time for fresh meat to keep it satisfied through the cold months. Day 75. This will be my last entry. I can feel it calling to me, the hunger reaching up from below. Mrs. Cruz says it won't hurt if I don't fight it. Says the cold takes you gently if you let it. If someone finds this, run. Get out while you still can. Don't trust her. Don't believe anything she tells you. The mountain has been hungry for so long, and it's never full. The last page was blank except for dark stains that looked like dried blood. I closed the notebook and sat in the darkness of my room, listening to the lodge breathe around me, creaking timber and settling stones, but underneath that, something else. A deep rhythmic sound like a massive heartbeat coming from far below. The guests weren't guests at all. They were the remains of everyone who'd come before, trapped in an endless cycle of hunger that fed the thing beneath Blackpine Lodge. And Fern, Christ, Fern had been doing this for decades, maybe longer, collecting cooks like me, teaching us to prepare the meals, then feeding us to the ancient thing when it was time. I walked back to the freezer then, had to see for myself, had to confirm what I already knew in my bones. The ice-covered walls reflected everything in distorted angles, and there I was, standing among the hanging bodies with that same blue-white skin and vacant eyes. My reflection's mouth hung open in a silent scream, and frost gathered in my hair like a crown of winter. The meat hook went through my spine just like the others, and my hands hung at my sides with scratches on the palms where I'd tried to claw my way back to warmth. I was looking at my own inevitable fate, frozen in ice and time. I had to get out. That was all I could think about after reading Alvin's notebook. Every word of it burned into my brain like brands. The frozen bodies in the freezer, my own reflection hanging among them. I couldn't stay another night. Couldn't serve another meal to those things that weren't guests. But when I checked my jacket pocket the next morning, my keys were gone. I'd left them right there on the small dresser in room 7, same place I'd put them every night since arriving. Now the brass key ring sat empty except for the lodge room key, that old brass thing with the hand-filed teeth that Fern had given me. I tore through my duffel bag, checked under the bed, even looked in the bathroom sink. Nothing. My hands were shaking as I searched, not from the cold, the lodge kept itself warm enough, but from something deeper, the kind of trembling that starts in your bones when you realize you're trapped. I had to check the truck anyway. Maybe I'd dropped the keys somewhere near it, maybe they'd fallen in the dirt. The morning air bit at my face as I stepped outside, and I could smell snow coming even though the sky looked clear. The mountains do that, change weather without warning. The truck sat where I'd left it, looking more beaten up than ever next to that black sedan. Still couldn't figure out who that belonged to, never saw anyone else around except Fern, and she didn't seem like the sedan type. I checked under the truck, around the tires, even popped the hood to see if somehow the keys had gotten caught in the engine compartment. Nothing, just my dying truck and that sick feeling in my stomach getting worse. That's when I noticed the trees. The access road, the same dirt path I'd driven up just days ago, was completely blocked. 3 massive pines lay across it like fallen soldiers, their trunks thick as barrels and their branches creating an impenetrable wall. The wood looked fresh cut where they'd broken, sap still bleeding dark amber tears onto the rocky ground. But here's the thing that made my chest tight with panic. Those trees hadn't been there yesterday. I was sure of it. I'd walked down toward the road the evening before, just to get some air after reading Alvin's notebook. The path had been clear then, narrow and winding, but clear. Now it was like someone had taken a giant's axe to the forest. I walked closer to examine the fallen trunks, my feet crunching on pine needles and small branches. The trees were real enough. I could smell the fresh pine scent, feel the sticky sap when I touched the cut ends. But the way they'd fallen, it was too perfect, too deliberate, like they'd been placed rather than blown down by wind. There wasn't any storm last night, no wind strong enough to topple trees this size. I stood there staring at the blocked road, feeling the mountain pressing down on me from all sides. The lodge behind me, the cliff drop-off to the left, impenetrable forest to the right, and now this, nature itself conspiring to keep me trapped. That's when I remembered the final rule from Alvin's list, the one that had seemed completely insane when I first read it. If all else fails, prepare the feast they expect. Use only what's provided. Leave it by the service elevator. Do not watch. Do not listen. When you hear silence, you have minutes to run. I'd thought it was the ramblings of someone who'd lost their mind, but standing there looking at those impossible fallen trees, with my keys vanished and no way down the mountain, maybe insane was exactly what this situation called for. The service elevator. I'd noticed it during Fern's tour but never used it. A freight elevator at the back of the kitchen that went down to what she'd called storage levels. Now I understood what those levels really contained, where that ancient thing lived and waited to be fed. I had maybe 6 hours before Fern would expect me to start dinner prep. 6 hours to figure out what the feast they expect actually meant, and whether I was desperate enough to try feeding something that had been consuming people for decades. Back in the kitchen, I started going through the walk-in with different eyes, not looking for normal ingredients anymore, but for whatever this thing, this entity under the mountain, actually wanted to eat. The meat hanging in there wasn't just food storage, it was a menu. The human bodies were in the back section, but the front held more conventional livestock. Beef quarters, pork shoulders, whole chickens hanging by their feet, all of it looking normal enough, except when I really focused, when I let myself see instead of just looking, patterns emerged. The cuts were too precise, too ritualistic, each piece positioned at exact angles, like they'd been arranged for ceremony rather than storage. And the smell underneath the normal meat scent, that sweet rot I'd been noticing, was stronger here, deliberate. I found what I needed in the dry storage room, hidden behind sacks of flour and rice, a wooden crate with symbols carved into its sides, symbols that hurt to look at directly. Inside were ingredients I couldn't name, dried things that might have been herbs or might have been something else entirely, packets of powder that smelled like copper and burnt earth, vials of liquid that moved too slowly to be water. My hands shook as I lifted each item. This was what Alvin had meant by what's provided, not normal cooking supplies, but offerings, components for something that wasn't really cooking at all. I spent the afternoon preparing what I can only call a feast in the loosest sense of the word, following instincts I didn't understand, mixing ingredients that shouldn't go together, seasoning meat with powders that made my eyes water and my throat close up. The smell filled the kitchen, sweet and rotten and somehow hungry. The worst part was how right it felt, like my hands knew exactly what they were doing, even though my mind screamed that this was wrong. I'd been trained to cook food that nourished people. This was something else, something that fed things that had never been human. By the time I finished, the sun was setting behind the mountains. The feast, 3 full platters of things I couldn't name anymore, sat steaming on the prep counter, steam that moved in patterns, forming shapes that almost looked like faces before dissolving. The service elevator waited in the back corner of the kitchen like an open mouth, just a simple freight lift with rope pulleys and a wooden platform, but standing in front of it felt like standing at the edge of a cliff. I could smell the depths below, that sweet rot smell magnified until it made me gag. I loaded the platters onto the elevator platform and pulled the rope that would send it down. The pulleys creaked as the platform descended, disappearing into darkness that seemed to swallow the food whole. Then I waited. Alvin's rule said not to watch, not to listen, but I couldn't help myself. I stood there in the kitchen, straining my ears for any sound from below. What came up from those depths wasn't sound exactly. It was vibration that I felt in my chest, in my teeth, in the bones of my skull, like something enormous was moving down there, shifting its bulk as it approached the offering. Then came the feeding sounds, wet tearing noises and satisfied rumbling that seemed to shake the entire lodge. It went on for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. The sounds of something ancient and massive consuming what I'd prepared for it, and underneath those sounds, something that might have been contentment, pleasure. When silence finally came, it was sudden and complete, not just quiet, true silence, like the mountain itself was holding its breath. I ran, not toward my room to pack, not toward the front door where Fern might see me. I went straight through the kitchen's back exit, the one that led to the maintenance shed and the hiking trails beyond. My chef's whites were still stained with whatever I'd been cooking. My hands still reeked of those impossible spices, but none of that mattered now. The mountain wilderness opened up before me, rocky slopes covered in pine trees, game trails that wound between boulders the size of cars. I'd grown up hiking in Colorado before my life fell apart, before I ended up at Blackpine Lodge. My legs remembered how to navigate steep terrain, how to find stable footing on loose scree. Behind me, the lodge grew smaller with each step. I could see lights in its windows, warm and welcoming from a distance, like a postcard of mountain hospitality instead of the feeding ground it really was. The temperature dropped as I climbed higher, but I kept moving. Had to put distance between myself and whatever lived under that mountain. The trail was treacherous in the growing darkness, loose rocks that could turn an ankle, drop-offs hidden by shadows. But I'd rather break my neck falling than go back to that kitchen. Hours passed. My lungs burned in the thin air. My legs ached from the constant uphill climb, but I could feel it. The lodge's influence loosening its grip with each mile. The oppressive weight that had been pressing down on me since I arrived was finally lifting. When I finally saw lights in the valley below, real lights from a real town with real people who weren't echoes of the consumed, I almost cried with relief. The supernatural entity's hunger temporarily satisfied by my desperate offering, I'd managed to escape the lodge's immediate influence and make my way to safety, leaving behind that cursed kitchen and Fern Cruz's deadly operation. I thought distance would save me. Had to, right? Get far enough away from that mountain, from Fern and whatever lived beneath those rocks, and I'd be free. Simple geography, physics. The farther you go, the weaker the signal gets. Took me 3 weeks to find steady work after I stumbled into that valley town. My clothes still carried the smell of those supernatural spices, sweet rot and copper pennies, no matter how many times I washed them. The diner manager in Pueblo looked at my references, what few I could give without mentioning Blackpine Lodge, and shrugged. You start Monday, 6 a.m. prep. The kitchen smelled like every other restaurant I'd worked, fryer oil and bleach, coffee burning on hot plates, normal smells that should have been comforting. I kept my head down, followed orders, chopped vegetables into precise quarter-inch cubes the way I'd been trained years before any of this started. But something was wrong with the food. Not immediately. First few days went fine. I made decent scrambled eggs, flipped pancakes without burning them, kept the grill clean, muscle memory taking over. Then I noticed things, small things. The bacon strips would curl differently when I turned away. Not the normal sizzle and contract you'd expect. They'd twist into shapes, spirals mostly, sometimes letters I couldn't quite read. I'd glance back at the grill, and everything looked normal again. Bacon cooking the way bacon should. But I'd seen it, felt it in my peripheral vision. That deliberate movement, like something was rearranging itself when I wasn't looking directly. The eggs were worse. I'd crack them into the pan, turn to grab salt, turn back and find the yolks had shifted position, not broken or spread, moved 3 inches to the left, facing a different direction. Still perfectly intact, just relocated. Like someone had picked them up and set them down somewhere else while I was reaching for seasoning. "You okay, Dennis?" the manager would ask when he caught me staring at the grill for too long. Food doesn't cook itself, but it did move itself. Every single dish I prepared. The hash browns would rearrange into patterns, circles, triangles, sometimes shapes that hurt to look at directly. Reminded me of those symbols carved into the wooden crate back at the lodge. Pancake batter would form letters in the pan before I could pour it properly. Always the same letter, H, then E, then L, then P. I lasted 2 weeks in Pueblo before I quit without notice. Denver was supposed to be different. Big city, lots of noise and distraction. I found work at an upscale place downtown. Real kitchen, proper equipment, chef who knew what he was doing. The pay was decent, the staff professional. I rented a studio apartment 6 blocks away and walked to work every morning through crowds of normal people living normal lives. The phone calls started my second week. First one came at 2 in the morning. Phone ringing in my empty apartment, that sharp digital chirp that cuts through sleep like a knife. I fumbled for it in the dark, pressed it to my ear without checking the number. Help me. My own voice. Definitely my voice, but different, desperate, echoing like it was coming from somewhere deep underground. Please, I'm still here. I'm still cooking. I can't stop cooking. I hung up, checked the caller ID. No number listed, just static where digits should be. The voice kept calling, every night, sometimes twice. Always the same desperate pleading, always my voice, but wrong somehow. Hollow, like it was traveling through miles of rock and earth to reach me. "The meat won't stop bleeding," it would say. "The guests are still watching. I've been cooking for months, but the orders never end. Please come back. Please help me." I stopped answering, let it go to voicemail, but the messages kept coming. My own voice begging for rescue from chambers that sounded impossibly deep. I could hear other sounds in the background sometimes, wet tearing noises, satisfied rumbling that shook whatever room the other me was trapped in. I changed my number twice. The calls found me anyway. Work became its own nightmare. Every reflective surface in the kitchen showed someone else, not me, someone who looked like me but wasn't. Hollow cheeks, sunken eyes, hands that moved frantically even when mine stayed still. This other Dennis was always cooking, always preparing impossible meals in a kitchen that stretched beyond the edges of whatever steel surface I was looking at. I'd catch glimpses in pot bottoms, knife blades, the chrome surface of the walk-in door. Always the same scene, this hollow-eyed version of myself working desperately in an endless kitchen, steam rising from platters of food that seemed to move on its own, guests that were just shadows standing at the edge of vision with their mouths open too wide. The other Dennis would sometimes notice me watching. He'd look up from whatever he was preparing, make eye contact through the steel, and mouth words I couldn't understand. Warnings, maybe. Or please. His hands would gesture frantically at something behind him, something I couldn't see, something that made his face twist with terror. I stopped looking at reflective surfaces, kept my eyes on cutting boards, plates, anything that wouldn't show me that other kitchen, but I could feel him there anyway, could sense him working frantically in every piece of stainless steel around me, trapped in a reality that existed parallel to mine, but infinitely worse. The head chef noticed my performance slipping. "You're jumpy," he said one afternoon while I was prepping vegetables. Distracted. Whatever's going on outside work, leave it outside. But it wasn't outside work. It was inside work. Inside every reflection, inside every dish I prepared. The supernatural influence was baked into everything I touched, every ingredient I handled, every meal I tried to prepare like a normal person. I quit Denver after a month. The other staff was starting to notice things too, asking why the soup ladles kept rearranging themselves in the pot, why steam from my dishes formed shapes that looked like faces, why I'd sometimes stop mid-chop and stare at nothing for minutes at a time. Phoenix, Albuquerque, Tucson, Salt Lake City, I kept moving, kept finding work, kept thinking the next city would be far enough. Each kitchen brought the same problems. Food that moved when I wasn't watching directly. My own voice calling from underground chambers that couldn't exist. Reflections that showed that other Dennis, trapped in his endless cooking hell, growing more desperate each time I glimpsed him. In Salt Lake, the other Dennis started leaving messages. I'd come to work and find notes written in what looked like my handwriting, but shakier, more frantic. "Stop running," they'd say. "You can't escape. Come back before it's too late." I'd find them tucked under my knife roll, taped to my locker, slipped between order tickets. Always my handwriting, but wrong somehow. Like it was written by someone whose hands wouldn't stop shaking. The calls got worse too. Instead of just pleading for help, the other me started describing things, what the guests really looked like under their human masks, how the meat in the freezer whispered names of people who'd disappeared decades ago, how Fern would visit him in that underground kitchen, bringing new recipes that required ingredients that shouldn't exist. "She says you're coming back," the voice told me one night, crackling through static that sounded like wind through pine trees. "She says distance doesn't matter. She says the mountain has you now, no matter where you go." I started drinking. Not much at first, just enough to sleep without dreams of hanging bodies and bleeding vegetables. But the alcohol made the reflections worse. The other Dennis became more visible, more desperate, reaching toward me through steel surfaces like he was trying to claw his way out of whatever hell he was trapped in. In Portland, I lasted 3 days. The head chef fired me after I screamed at a stock pot that wouldn't stop bubbling even though the burner was off. I'd been stirring soup, normal vegetable soup, when I noticed the carrots spelling out words. "Help me," then "come back," then something that might have been too late before I knocked the whole pot onto the floor. "Get some help," the chef said, not unkindly. "Whatever you're dealing with, this isn't the place to work through it." But there wasn't anywhere to work through it. Every kitchen was the same kitchen. Every reflection showed the same trapped version of myself. Every phone call brought the same desperate voice begging for rescue from chambers that got deeper and darker each time I heard them described. Seattle. The rain should have been cleansing, washing away whatever invisible thread still connected me to that mountain. I found work at a seafood place near Pike Place Market. Thought maybe working with fish instead of meat would make a difference. The salmon fillets bled dark liquid when I scored them. The crab legs moved like they were still alive, clicking against the cutting board in rhythms that sounded almost like Morse code. When I looked at them directly, everything appeared normal, fresh seafood, properly iced, ready for preparation. But the moment I looked away, the other Dennis was getting closer somehow. I could see him more clearly now in every reflective surface, could make out details of the kitchen he was trapped in. Industrial ranges that stretched beyond vision, hanging meat that swayed without wind, guests that stood in shadows, watching him work with eyes that reflected light like animals. And behind it all, just at the edge of what I could see, something massive moved in the darkness. Something that made wet breathing sounds and occasionally rumbled with what might have been satisfaction. The thing from beneath the mountain, still feeding, still waiting. The package showed up on a Tuesday. I remember that detail because I'd been working doubles at the seafood place, and Tuesday was my only day off. The one morning I could sleep past 5 without my hands shaking from muscle memory. I was drinking instant coffee from a chipped mug when I heard the knock. Not the usual mailman knock either. This was deliberate. 3 sharp raps that made my teeth ache the same way those voices at the lodge used to. Should have known better than to open it. The delivery guy looked normal enough. Brown uniform, clipboard, bored expression. But when he handed me the manila envelope, his fingers felt cold through the paper. That same desperate cold I'd felt when Fern first shook my hand. "Dennis Baldwin?" he asked, even though I hadn't told him my name. I nodded and signed for it, watched him walk back to his truck, except when I glanced through the peephole 30 seconds later, the street was empty. No truck, no tire marks in the rain puddles. The envelope had my name typed across the front in that old-fashioned typewriter font. Same style as the guest check papers at the lodge. My hands were already trembling before I tore it open. Inside, 3 sheets of cream-colored paper, official letterhead at the top, Blackpine Lodge Personnel Department. Below that, my employment record. Start date, position, salary. All the normal stuff you'd expect, except the end date column was blank, completely empty, like they were expecting me to work there forever. But it was the second page that made my coffee mug slip from my fingers. Permanent staff roster. Winter season. My name was there at the bottom of the list, typed in the same font as everyone else, like it had always belonged. Above me, maybe 20 other names. Some I recognized from Alvin's notebook. He'd mentioned a few of the previous cooks by name. Others were completely new. All of them had start dates, none had end dates. The third page was worse. A memo dated 3 days ago, from Fern Cruz to all department heads. Subject line, Staff Member Baldwin, expected return. Mr. Baldwin remains on temporary leave but will resume kitchen duties as scheduled. His absence has been noted and accommodated. Please ensure his station remains prepared for immediate occupancy. Winter feeding schedule will proceed as planned. F. Cruz, General Manager. I dropped the papers and backed away from them like they were on fire, but I could still see my name there, printed in black ink, official as a death certificate. They'd never removed me from payroll, never processed my termination. In their records, I'd just stepped out for a smoke break that happened to last 6 months. That's when I felt it again. That pull I'd been trying to ignore for weeks. It started as a dull ache behind my sternum, like heartburn from bad coffee. But it wasn't heartburn. This was deeper, hungrier. The same sensation I'd felt every time I tried to leave the lodge's property. That invisible rope around my chest, tugging me back toward something massive and patient and eternally starving. The thing beneath the mountain, the entity Alvin had written about, it was calling me home. I tried to shake it off the way I'd been doing since Seattle. Took a cold shower, went for a walk, tried to focus on normal things like rent money and grocery lists, but the pull kept getting stronger. Every day, every hour, like a tide that never quite receded. Worst part? I was starting to miss it. The lodge, I mean. The rhythm of prep work, the satisfaction of a clean mise en place, the way the massive ranges held heat so perfectly. Even the impossible stuff, the moving food, the whispering ovens, the guests who weren't quite human. There was a purpose to it all, a meaning I'd never found in any other kitchen. I'd catch myself planning menus in my head, dishes I could never cook with normal ingredients, recipes that required those supernatural spices from the wooden crate, the ones that made steam form faces and meat pulse with borrowed heartbeats. My hands would start moving on their own, practicing knife cuts I'd learned in that cursed place. Techniques no culinary school ever taught. The other Dennis, my reflection in every steel surface, was getting clearer too, less frantic now, more patient, like he knew something I didn't want to admit. He was waiting for me to stop pretending, stop running from what I'd already become. Because the truth was, I'd never really left those kitchens, not completely. Part of me was still down there in the depths, feeding that ancient hunger, serving impossible meals to guests who'd been dead for decades. The part that understood what Fern really offered wasn't just employment, it was purpose, belonging, a place where my skills actually mattered, where every dish I prepared fed something vast and eternal and grateful. I was already on the menu, had been since the moment I signed that first contract. Every cook who came to the lodge became an ingredient eventually, not just our flesh but our knowledge, our techniques, our desperate need to create something meaningful in a world that mostly didn't care about what we did. The ancient thing beneath the mountain collected us, absorbed us, made us part of its endless feast, while keeping us conscious enough to appreciate the artistry. We weren't just food. We were collaborators in something bigger than any restaurant, any career, any life we could have built outside those walls. And the worst part? I was grateful for it. Even now, even knowing what waited for me, I felt that gratitude growing in my chest like a tumor made of relief. Soon enough, another desperate cook would answer Fern's job posting. Some broken-down chef with nowhere else to go, just like I'd been. They'd drive up that mountain road with their duffel bag and their last few dollars, thinking they'd found salvation in the middle of nowhere. I'd be there to train them, to show them how the ranges worked, how to read the ancient recipes, how to prepare meals that satisfied hungers no normal food could touch. And when their time came, I'd help them understand that becoming part of the feast wasn't an ending. It was a transformation. The supernatural bond wasn't a chain. It was an umbilical cord, feeding me purpose and meaning, and the only kind of immortality that actually mattered. I'd spend eternity doing what I loved, serving something that appreciated every knife cut, every seasoning choice, every moment of terror that made the meat more tender. I was trapped between two worlds, the normal one where I'd never amount to anything, and the lodge where I'd already become exactly what I was meant to be. The ancient entity's hunger would never be satisfied, and neither would mine. We were perfect for each other.